Welcome to Engineered for Impact, a show helping engineers learn and think more about how they can have a positive social impact with their careers. In this episode, I talked to Arno Rivera, a social entrepreneur who is working in the agricultural sector in Tanzania. 7 years ago, Arno left his applications engineering role to start what has since become the largest private sector employer in one of the poorest regions of Tanzania to help stimulate economic growth in the area. We discuss the role of social enterprises in developing economies and the lessons that he's learnt so far from his journey. In doing so, we cover some of the challenges that social enterprises face in sub-Saharan Africa and the ways in which they can actually help governments improve their processes. We also discuss the difficulty of measuring impact, particularly in the climate positive impact of carbon emission reductions. You'll find show notes with valuable resources related to this episode and ways to support the podcast at engineeredforimpact.show/Arno. That's ARNO. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, leave a comment or a review, and share it with your friends or colleagues. So, without further ado, here's Arno.
Yeah, my name is Arno Rivera. Currently, we have a few projects. The most advanced of those is in honey exporting. So very high level, and we can, I guess, go down into the details a bit more if you want later on. Aggregating from smallholder beekeepers in Tanzania or certifying that as organic and basically sending it up to large importers in Europe and the US at the moment primarily. And then also we have projects at sort of earlier stages in fisheries, so in cage aquaculture in Lake Tanganyika, and then also in biochar that we're starting up down in the southern highlands of Tanzania.
Awesome. So earlier in your career, you worked as a sales engineer in Western Australia, but now you're in Tanzania. So how did you come to be working on these sorts of social enterprises in Tanzania?
Yeah, so basically I studied mechanical engineering and chemistry at the University of Western Australia. And being from WA, you basically end up in resources very quickly. And so I ended up in the oil and gas industry. And by luck, I sort of went into the engineering around the drill bit of drilling wells. And so a lot of that is to do with sales. And so basically I was working in that in Australia for a few years and then actually moved over with the same company to Angola. And I was doing that for 2 or 3 years. And I think I always had the idea to try and do something, I guess, in sub-Saharan Africa in terms of just miscellaneous business. Essentially, the idea was, and it was more loosely formed back then, but along the lines of, Peter Singer, The Life You Can Save, and trying to, instead of just donating money, actually trying to do something there to build up economic growth in the area. After leaving the oil industry, after saving a bit of money, went across to Tanzania. My business partner, Alex, he had actually done his master's thesis in Kigoma, which happens to also be one of the poorest regions in Tanzania. So I'd been across there to help him out with a couple of other projects that he was working on, and said, okay, this is a nice enough place. I can see myself being here, and I can see that starting something up here will have a, I guess, slightly outsized impact because no one else is doing it. And then sort of looked, okay, what are social enterprises which can help a lot of people in Kigoma, and very, very quickly you find yourself in agriculture. And so we actually looked at a few different agricultural value chains and sort of went through and said, okay, what can actually benefit from a private sector actor and what can be sustainable pretty quickly, a sustainable business. And so basically that's how we ended up at Honey. Essentially said, okay, honey, you have a lot of honey being produced in the vicinity, and at the moment, a lot of the value is being lost because of poor processing techniques and not being able to access export markets. And so by creating a company where you can aggregate high volumes, basically the minimum lot size that most buyers have is sort of 20 tons, so a full container load. And for most traditional beekeepers, that's just way out of the realm of possibility for them. And then so homogenizing that into 20-ton batches, and then having the ability to certify as organic and into other food safety certifications gives you access to better markets and higher pricing. And so I guess although the engineering that I did study and worked in isn't directly comparable to what I'm doing today, like it's very helpful. So like what I learned on the job in terms of just using standard operating procedures and having a lot of the ways and the methods that we use in all large company engineering, I've tried to bring across, and our company is very SOP oriented, which makes it a better company. And also just a lot of the design work and like my old school engineering stuff, like just double checking when we were building a warehouse, double checking the civil engineering calcs to make sure that the beams and stuff were the right size. So basic stuff like that was very, very handy to have.
That's awesome. So tell me a little bit more about Upendo Honey and who's sort of are the beneficiaries of the organization.
Yeah, so I guess there's a couple of ways you can split that up. So the direct beneficiaries, you could say, definitely the employees of the company, in that we're primarily focused on female employment, basically because in Kigoma it's like I say, like it's a city of a couple of 100,000 people, but at the same time, there's not a lot of formal employment, and we're not a big company by any stretch of the imagination. And by the official statistics of the region, we're the largest private sector employer there, and we have somewhere in the vicinity of 100 people, and the majority of our staff are women, and so providing formal employment for women, I think, is something which is a nice beneficiary of the company. And then separately, of course, there's the beekeepers. They would have been able to sell their honey, of course, to other traders if we weren't there. So I'm not saying that like all of it is benefit to them, but from our understanding from what we've looked, and we're pretty cynical on these numbers. Like we don't like nonsense development numbers. We're somewhere in the vicinity of 20 to 50% above the market rate in terms of what we price our honey at, and I think that's a nice thing. So they get a higher income, and so we work directly with about 3,500 beekeepers, and that translates to, and this again ballpark. So we're getting into some nonsense development figures again, but somewhere in the vicinity of 18 to 20,000 sort of indirect beneficiaries after the beekeepers. And then more indirectly, where we see it is just improving the business environment in Kigoma for one, and then Tanzania again. And that's through some basic things like forcing probably isn't the right word, but working with the authorities to have to do their business practices a bit more efficiently. So whether that's TRA, the Tanzanian Revenue Authority, who are responsible for taxes, or if it's TFS, who's the Tanzanian Forestry Services, who are responsible for beekeeping in the country. it's sort of working with them to make their processes more streamlined and more efficient, because basically we need their processes to work properly, and because we're now the largest exporter of honey, that's sort of making them do those things. And one book actually, which really changed my thinking around these things, is called Building State Capacity. I'll have to double check the authors, so I don't want to say them now. But I guess I'm not sure if you have show notes, but I guess you can add them. And that one really made me understand that these government agencies, they have people that might not have the same complete level of competence, but regardless of competence level, most of them are trying to do the right thing and trying to do their jobs, but they just don't have nearly enough people to do the same roles. As an example, the regional government office in Kigoma, which is responsible for about 2.5-3 million people, probably has in the vicinity of 50 to 100 people working there for the entire state government equivalent, which is mildly absurd when you think of it. And so so you have to understand that these guys, or even if they want to help you as much as they can, they just don't have the capacity and they don't have the capabilities and manpower to do it. And so because of that, you just have to be very patient and have to help them to do their job. So reading that book sort of makes you a lot more patient and a lot more forgiving of that sort of stuff. And when you might have expectations of a government in another country, you just have to understand that these guys are overworked and undermanned. So give them the benefit of the doubt, and it makes life a lot nicer if you sort of embrace that.
Yeah, I can imagine without that philosophy, it could just lead to a lot of frustration and I guess angst in just trying to do as much good as you can, but feeling like you're rubbing up against, a government who's just, for whatever reason, doesn't quite want to go at the same pace as you, but for very good reason. Mm. So what does that interaction look like when you're helping the governments help you achieve your organization's objectives?
So in Tanzania, and I imagine there are some similarities and obviously some differences between different countries, but it involves a lot of letter writing, and I'm talking like physical letters, and then a lot of sitting down with the miscellaneous government bureaucrats that deal with the different matters. So it's oftentimes it's not going straight to the top that helps. It's oftentimes finding the one or two people within the entire agency that deal with it and are the, subject matter experts for the particular piece that you're talking about, and sitting with them for hours sometimes and figuring out what the solution is to the answer. So an example of that is we're registered as an export processing zone company. And the way that the regulations are written don't really make sense for any company that isn't based in Dar es Salaam, the capital city of Tanzania. And so we basically sat with the people at TRA for, like I said, many hours and figured out, what methodologies and what procedures can we use that work within the regulations, but at the same time can still function for companies outside of Dar es Salaam. And, after a bit of back and forthing, and then also working with different levels of government throughout the country, so in the regional and then in the district as well in Kigoma, as well as different levels in Dar es Salaam, we managed to basically work out a system that worked for both parties. And so until today, we're still using it. I think other companies are also potentially riding on that sort of to and froing. So I guess that's a micro example of how it might work when we're having some problems with the government. Not problems probably isn't the right word, where you're finding the regulations aren't quite fit for purpose.
That makes sense. What do you think makes or allows social enterprises such as yours to step in and play this role of helping to improve government practice? Is there something about the approach that you bring in as being sort of coming from Australia or coming from an area of the world where government practice is just different? Perhaps they've been created by governments who have more manpower to sort of refine those practices, and you can sort of bring them across and import them, so to speak? Or are there other sort of factors that make social enterprises particularly well placed for this kind of intervention?
Yeah, so to be honest, because of not running a company in Australia, I wouldn't know. And I actually, now I don't think I would think I'd be better suited to running companies in somewhere like Tanzania, just because I've talked to friends that run companies in Australia, and if you have a problem there, basically it just ends up in a big mess of bureaucracy, and you can't really do anything about it. Whereas in Tanzania, the nice thing is that you can just rock up to the agency and find the person that's responsible, sit at their desk and say, let's solve this. So I think, I don't know that it's directly coming from Australia that helps, but there's definitely a difference in the way that the government reacts to business as opposed to like an NGO or development agency, in that they recognize that you have skin in the game. And so because of that, they seem to be more willing to work with you to make something work. Whereas so they understand that in order for them to get additional Forex, they need to be able to export honey, for instance. And so because of that, they want to work with people that are trying to do it to make it happen. Whereas if a development agency or something came along and said, oh yeah, let's make the country better for exporting honey, because they aren't really doing it themselves, it's harder to see where the problems are. Until you're actually physically exporting something, you don't actually see where the hiccups are. And like you might be able to dig down into it and like see, okay, this is how the regulations work, this is how the flow works. But until you actually try to do it, you're still going to be missing some of the spots. And so I think that's where social enterprise can really come in, actually understanding and doing what's trying to be enacted. And that's where the government is more responsive, because they understand that, okay, if we don't make these changes, then we won't get the Forex, we won't get the FDI, and these sorts of things. So that's, I think one of the big benefits. And also, just on top of that, there's obviously the sustainability aspect of a company versus development or NGO, which I guess we can talk about a bit more later.
Yeah, it sounds good. We'll definitely touch on that later. So it seems that government sort of restrictions in the way of laws and policies are one of the sort of categories of problems that agricultural companies can face in Africa. Are there any others that you've sort of come across or that you have seen as being relatively like systematic?
Like there's always the corruption issue that people talk about, and like so some countries definitely there is corruption that you need to work through, and so you like Tanzania, luckily, it's very uncorrupt relative to a lot of other countries, and so because of that, it's easier. But like I say, the way that you get things done is you go and sit and spend time trying to solve an issue. Whereas, other places I know, like if you're trying to do stuff in the DRC, basically you have to pay some money, unfortunately. And so I think people have to understand that and understand the dynamics around that. and a lot of the time the corruption isn't actually it's obviously it's bad for some ways, but at the same time, a lot of the time it just goes to paying salaries because the state might not be there. Like the DRC is a good example. People that are working in customs offices, people that are working as police, like they might not be receiving any salaries because the government's completely useless. And so because of that, the corruption is just paying their salaries. So I guess the point is corruption, yes, it's bad, but at the same time, corruption sometimes, unfortunately, is necessary because it takes place of what the state should be doing otherwise. And then, in general, so another thing, I guess, another beneficiary of the company, which I forgot to add in before, is just the outside perceptions for the products and whatever that you're trying to sell in external markets. So for honey, one of the big issues that we face when we're talking to external buyers is basically they expect the quality to be exceedingly bad. And that's essentially because in the past they've purchased from other honey exporters in Africa and been burnt by essentially bad quality honey when it arrived at destination, even after passing pre-purchase quality checks. So there's definitely a perception issue that happens when you're going to sell in the external markets, which makes, so I guess the sales engineering portion of my job, the sales portion of that engineering job, quite relevant. And so that's something where you get additional certifications to make the end buyer more certain of the quality of your product. And so in saying that, the additional beneficiary of us going out and selling honey in the rest of the world is the honey market in the world saying, okay, actually maybe Tanzania and by extension other African countries, because unfortunately for a lot of the world, Africa is one country, then we can buy from them because we know this producer and they have given us good quality product and they've been a good quality supplier and professional. And so therefore, there are professional suppliers in the continent. And I think that's a big thing which, again, isn't written about that much and which I see as one of the bigger beneficiaries of working in the way that we're working.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. It seems like it's the kind of thing that could just over time have really large, like far-reaching effects across the continent, really.
Mm.
So when you're looking at these different beneficiaries, and you mentioned before how you're not a fan of sort of fuzzy global development figures. So how do you go about measuring the impact you're having across these different beneficiaries?
So I guess this is one area where I disagree with a lot of EA on is the random Easter methodologies and like taking that as gospel, because I've seen how a lot of those numbers come and a lot of it is just nonsense. Like the way that baseline surveys are done, all the rest of it. I see, if someone, a lot of those that come from 3-hour-long surveys sitting in a household, and the guys that are taking the surveys and the guys that are, providing the information, after a 3-hour-long interview, like they get very bored and just start making up numbers. So, I think it's very hard to measure impact. The only way I can say is sometimes you sort of have to say, okay, we're getting traction with what we're doing. I see the amount of money that is flowing into the company and through the company into Tanzania, and I see where that's going to, and basically working off of that. So again, like I say, we're pretty skeptical of our own numbers, much less other numbers. And so the way I sort of look at it is we're like a slightly less efficient give well, if you will, in that our money is maybe not going directly to the most in need beneficiaries and targeted beneficiaries, give directly, I should say. But at the same time, it is revolving and it doesn't need money to only every dollar that goes in, it keeps going year after year because it is a sustainable practice. So I guess that's sort of the way that we look at it, is kind of give directly, but yeah, kind of not. So look, short answer, it's very, very hard. And I won't even pretend to be mentoring essentially. And we've done a very back of the napkin impact study on CO2 and all this sort of stuff. And it comes out with nonsense numbers. So I can send it to you and you can have a look, but it's just silly. So we like to say, okay, we've done a back of the napkin estimate, but it's very hard to actually say these things. And if you take things with a grain of salt, then I think that's probably better than saying we're saving the world with whatever we're doing. It's incremental change that's, I think, we have to accept.
Yeah, that makes sense. It seems like a very fuzzy area to be able to measure real direct impact, just in general from all the difficulties. Is that figure that you're referring to the 204,000 tons of CO2?
Yeah, exactly.
That's the one, which I calculated. That's equivalent to the yearly emissions of 12,750 Americans.
Yeah.
Which is a lot.
Yeah, exactly, right. And it's a lot of people use that, and so we can start talking about carbon markets a little bit later on when we get into the biochar project. But that's what a lot of people are buying in terms of credits out there. Essentially back in the napkin estimates like that, they're paying money for that. And yeah, it's very questionable whether those are actually true. Anyway.
I can understand your skepticism then. We'll get to the biochar project in a sec, but just to linger on the sort of the carbon reductions from the honey organization, what's the sort of mechanism by which carbon emissions are reduced or reverted by the honey?
Yeah, growing, so the primary idea is that by monetizing forests, you're reducing deforestation. So basically, beekeepers are there, they're deriving an income from the forest. And so because of that, they are incentivized to reduce deforestation. So there's a lot of deforestation that occurs because people start basically clearing forest, which is considered that it should be forest, but it is because of the way that, like we were talking before, there aren't enough people to sort of police the areas. They will chop down the trees and build a little shamba farm. And so the idea is that if you can monetize the forest, then there's incentives for the beekeepers to be policing where people are chopping trees down, and the villagers are also stopping that as well. So that's sort of the idea and the theory. Again, I'm quite skeptical on that causal relationship, and I haven't seen phenomenal evidence that that's actually true. I would like it to be true, but at the same time, it's hard to say. And if you look at the document that the back of the napkin estimates that we put in there, that 200,000 number, and we've already put a very low percentage on how much of the reduced deforestation is due to our impact. So if you actually take more of it, then the number blows out to millions of tons.
Interesting. So I think that document was produced by your co-founder.
Yeah, correct? So it was produced by Alex and then also Isabel. and we've got another lady working with us, Sophie. And so, yeah, produced with them. I added a little bit, very, very little. And so, and they will also say the same thing, it was, we put it out there to like say, okay, because it was, people were asking us for some of these numbers, and like based on what other, I guess, studies have done and talked about, that's sort of what we went with. And like, it might be true, but I think it's just impossible to actually tease out the direct impact of beekeeping versus other things that are happening in the world, again, which is why randomista development is very, very hard, because even if we said, okay, let's do like complete randomista A/B testing, okay, we'll do beekeeping in this area versus not that area or something. There's other things that are happening. It's also like, how do you hold in place time constraints? It might have just be because of what's happening with the weather, what's happening with a lot of other things, what's the politics of the different villages. Like there's so much there that you can't control for, that, yeah, okay, it might work on like medical studies where you've got 1 million people or a few thousand people and you're really doing A/B testing on that sort of thing. Although there's a lot of evidence, so we won't go deep down into it, but there's a lot of evidence nowadays that a lot of the randomista trials and that are nonsense. But for very, very complex societal systems, like we have in Tanzania, in all of the world, it's very, very hard to actually tease out some of these effects. And I think we're somewhat kidding ourselves thinking that we can, to be honest.
Do you think it's better to have some number, even if it's kind of the state-of-the-art back-of-the-napkin calculation? Is it still better than nothing? Or does it just need so much caveating that it kind of loses a bit of its or most of its meaning?
I think it's good to do the exercise. So I think it's good to do back of the napkining, and then you can sort of ballpark between, I'll use the word intervention, between two different interventions or businesses or whatever, and you can say, okay, this makes more sense than the other one. And then you can make a sensitivity analysis in there and say, okay, what if these are different? How does that impact it? And so it can help inform your decisions, I think, is fine. But saying, okay, this is going to have X impact because of what we've done, I think that's hard to say. So there's a possibility that us being in the honey industry as an example, because we're getting more people into honey, that's stopped another industry from going forward, which would have had a big impact. So I guess this goes into sort of like some of the cluelessness stuff that EA looks into. But at the same time, I think, so short answer, yes, I think it is useful still to have numbers in mind and like do out your Excel spreadsheet, but don't take it as gospel and don't take it as like that's actually what's happening. But it's a good way to inform decision-making process still. So yeah.
That makes sense. So how did you find your co-founders for this? I think you mentioned before you were friends with one, but it seems like as somebody coming into any foreign country, let alone Tanzania, it seems a very daunting and challenging thing to find co-founders for such a social enterprise.
Yeah, so Alex, he was a good mate from university. We lived together. He didn't study engineering; he studied something much less useful, which is basically anything apart from engineering, of course, right? And so we had done a lot of like stupid traveling back in the day, and so and actually, funnily enough, like being able to do stupid traveling is actually a reasonable mapping exercise onto whether or not you'd be able to function in like run a business or whatever in a country like Tanzania, because it's a lot of it is basically problem solving and figuring out solutions on how to navigate foreign environments. So there's not like, a lot of the skill set that you'd have in like, okay, how do I travel across, I don't know, Mongolia or something, is not, and like, not having language, blah, 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 is not dissimilar to figuring out how to export honey. So, and myself and Alex, we have been, very aligned on EA and Peter Singer and utilitarianism for a long time. And then we met our co-founder, Isabel, who was actually a long time in the development industry, and just happened to be Alex's next door neighbor in Kigoma. And she had some experience in the beekeeping industry from a development standpoint. And so when we were first starting out and looking at projects and looking at beekeeping more seriously, we started, we were just asking her questions, saying, how do we do this? Like, what do you recommend for that? And then, like, after we were talking for a long time, like, we were aligned on sort of how we wanted to do things and what the business looked like. And she basically said, you know what, I really like what you're doing. I think what you're doing is a good thing, have an impact. And so she essentially quit her job and decided to join us. And she's been a fantastic resource. Great founder. And it's quite nice having multiple founders in that it gives voices to each other. And so, and you'll have different ideas on different things. So one of the things that we did when we first set up the shareholders agreement, and I think was quite important, was that each of us would have a veto right for anything. So basically it was a majority, it was a unanimous decision on major decisions. And this has been good in that, if for a business decision we're not able to convince everyone, then likely it's probably a bad decision anyway. And so I think that's a nice way to do these sorts of things, especially for major decisions. And I think it's worked out very well for the way that we've run things. And like, it tends to be that I'm the most optimistic in things, and then Alex is in the middle, and Isabel is a bit more pessimistic. And so it's also nice to have those different voices within the company, because it makes you stop and think a bit more and not do stupid things as much as you might do otherwise.
Yeah, that sounds like a really good balance of personalities to bring to the table, especially when it comes to making tough business decisions.
Yeah.
How would you recommend people who are interested in starting their own sort of social enterprise go about trying to find co-founders if they've got nobody that they're in their network already? What do you think would be good first steps to try to find people?
Yeah, so that's a tough question. And so I have had a few companies now and a few different co-founders, and I have failed a few times at finding Robert. I've had issues with business partners in the past, and so I think it's like one of the key things that you should look for is, I guess, alignment on values and alignment on vision of the company, and like at the get-go, figure out, okay, how do we make decisions? How do we run like basic things like finance functions, those sorts of things, because otherwise in the future it might bite you a little bit. And then, I guess there are two types of bad founders and bad business partners. The one type is one that I guess doesn't pull their weight, and they're not as bad as the other type, which, like, I guess directly impacts and makes bad decisions on behalf of the company and makes the company impossible to run. So my answer in trying to find good co-founders is I unfortunately don't have a great answer. And most of the time, I would say find people that you get along with. Like there's always the like the beer test, as people say, like, you know, being able to sit down and have a chat and be interested in what the other person is saying and talking about is, I think, key. So you can get along with them long term. And then, just unfortunately, you'll find out along the way on how someone works in a business environment. And sometimes that can only be found out when you're actually operating with them. And I guess the main thing is have a think prior to starting up the company. Okay, if this isn't working out, what happens? How do we resolve? How do we decide who buys out the other person? How do we make decisions? And like I say, the finance aspect, which is something that people probably don't think about that much at the start, is one of the more important, because money is what drives the company. And figuring out what those finance policies look like, how the decisions are made, who has that decisive power, especially if it's a business dynamic where one party is putting in more of the capital than the other. What does that look like? They're like those sorts of things. I would say just have those written down at the outset, as opposed to later on when you find you have issues, is sort of key.
Yeah. So let's chat for a little bit here about Dark Earth Carbon. So you've alluded to it previously, but tell me a little bit about Dark Earth Carbon and what problems it's trying to address.
Yeah, so Dark Earth Carbon, basically it is a biochar company. So biochar, for those not knowing, is essentially charcoal, which burning biomass in the absence of oxygen, and that you then, instead of reburning like you would with charcoal, you actually put it into the ground, and it acts as a soil amendment and also a carbon removal. So basically, the idea is that you're removing carbon from the air, because the wood waste, in our case, or biomass, would otherwise biodegrade or be burnt, and that carbon goes back into the atmosphere. And so instead of it going into the atmosphere, you're putting it into a stable form of carbon and then sequestering it into the earth as a soil amendment. And so we first started looking at it because basically it sort of makes sense as a soil amendment, and it's a very good. It doesn't completely replace fertilizer, but it reduces fertilizer requirements. Like it increases ion exchange, it increases moisture, water availability, that sort of stuff. And so we were looking at the numbers, and the numbers didn't quite stack up for biochar just by itself in terms of the operational cost and what potentially you could sell it at. And so then in the last couple of years, obviously carbon credits have come a bit more to the fore, and especially carbon removal credits. Instead of saying I'm not going to chop down this forest, so therefore you should give me money because that counts the carbon credit, you're saying I'm actually taking carbon out of the atmosphere and putting it into the ground, so like direct air capture. And so biochar is in that carbon removal side of things, because, like I said before, you actually it's effectively removing carbon from the atmosphere and putting it into the ground. And so there's a lot of studies that have been done on the permanence of biochar, and basically if you burn it in particular conditions, a lot of those are temperature related, you effectively get a 1,000 to 10,000 year permanence for a large portion of that biochar. And so that's basically what you're selling credits for. You're not selling credits for the stuff that's sub 100 years. The credits you're only really getting for the 100 plus year stuff. And so that, so those credits, like basically we're using to subsidize the soil amendment side. And those soil amendments, are very, very beneficial for particular soil types, and particularly in Africa, because it also has, I guess, a liming effect. So in an acidic soil, it will increase the pH, which is something which is quite valuable in an acidic soil. That's, I guess, the very high level overview of how biochar and how we're sort of looking at it.
Terrific. So if it's such a valuable amendment to the soil, how come it hasn't become a wider spread practice?
Yeah, so the way that biochar is made can cost a lot. And so we're going for, I guess, a low-cost industrial model, in that we're looking at large-scale machinery from China. Like our proof of concept is running not a huge amount of biomass, but about 1 ton per hour of input. And then it scales up from there. So basically it's being able to get like that industrial higher volume, low cost production model, which makes it make sense. And it works much more in an environment like Tanzania, because you do have low cost of labor. And, like I say, we're bringing across relatively cheap machinery, which has been used in other pyrolysis applications prior. So we're not reinventing the wheel, whereas a lot of other biochar is looking at bespoke machinery, which costs a lot more, and also doing it in places where labor is a lot more expensive. So I guess it's a combination of labor costs and the ability to use it in very like for the soils in Tanzania, and low cost machinery and the combination of it, like having a sales price for the biochar itself, but then also the credits, which has sort of come together to make it a possible thing. And we see it as something that can potentially be scaled to quite a high degree, because of like some of the benefits of biochar into soils, and especially nowadays, the paradigm is all about reducing fertilizer usage because of the geopolitics around fertilizer.
Okay. So what are some of the challenges in actually trying to set up sort of in a scalable sort of industry around that?
Yeah, so we haven't done it yet. It's, like I say, still quite new. We're still finalising actually the round to get that proof of concept forward. We should have it through in the next little while, though. I think it's about just operational efficiency. So and I guess one of the differences between the way that we look at things and the way that a lot of other startups might is that we want to have basically profitability from day one. So you don't need to say, okay, we need to be at multiple billions of dollars of revenue in order to be profitable, and cover our overheads. We want to be covering our overheads with even the proof of concept. So I think that's a bit of a different mindset, and having that allows you to basically be sure that it's, again, a sustainable business. So for us, sustainability isn't just something which, is good for the world and like actually makes sense, but also it's something that is financially sustainable, because if something can only work on handouts and can only work if it's, being given equity injections every few years, then that's potentially not sustainable as soon as the equity market falls out. which unfortunately we'll, I guess, be seeing with some of these VC funded startups over the next few years.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. So, in this work that you've done between the two organizations, and you also mentioned the fisheries project as well, what are some of the most important or most surprising lessons that you've learned from this social enterprise work so far?
I'm not sure that surprising is the, like, there's nothing, I guess, that I would have said, okay, 7 years ago, I'm surprised at this. Like, maybe, and I guess I shouldn't be surprised, like, on people just being willing to dick other people. It's pretty common, unfortunately. Just people screwing you over. So just be skeptical as much as possible, and oftentimes just expect the worst. And I think more of the lessons is just like how to run an organization, how to hire people, how to get those SOPs in place. What other business systems, like how to organize your finances, just normal, like, I guess, standard day-to-day things, which, like, the mapping I think the differences between running a company in Tanzania and running a company in Australia or the US or something, they aren't really that different in the end of the day. It's just making sure that you have that discipline around company systems and stuff makes a better company. And so once you've learned those lessons, and then you can apply them to other enterprises and apply them more to your current businesses, that's something which is, I think, quite valuable, and something which I wish I had sort of onboarded a bit more before I started looking at things. And I guess also in general, like, although the way that and things seem to be working out relatively okay now, the way that we went around choosing a business probably wasn't the best. I think so. One of the things that I sort of say to people that are looking to do, like, to start a business and looking for business opportunities in a place like Tanzania, is basically to assess 10 times more businesses than you originally think that you're going to assess, and do those back in the napkin estimations, make the Excel models for them to see if it makes sense. And then also, one of the other things that you should take into account is the fundability of the business. So some value chains, some businesses are more fundable than others. And so that should also be a metric that should be taken into account when looking at things.
What sort of funding sources are available?
Yeah, so, like, for a lot of businesses, like, and this is one of the things where, people talk about, I guess, the missing middle in terms of financing, like between 500K revenue and sort of 2 to 5 million revenue. It's quite hard to get funding sources. Like, local banks in Tanzania are quite hard to deal with and slow, and they want a lot of security. And then outside funders, it's hard for them to get to whatever. So I think if you can find businesses which are able to get funding from outside, so like Biochar business, as an example, we're working with a company up in Europe to provide funding for that first machine, because it is in the carbon credit space. And so the carbon credit space is a bit more fundable than potentially some other spaces around there. So I think there's, things like that, where you're looking at, okay, and like obviously fintech, SaaS, those sorts of things are always quite fundable. because of the global ways that like people are happy to fund them. So there are VCs around there that are happy to fund fintech companies and SaaS companies in sub-Saharan Africa, which is fantastic. And so because of that, it's easier sometimes to find funding for those sorts of companies than it might be for like a honey exporting company, for instance. I think that's something which I should have taken into account a bit more, or we should have back in the day. And I think other people should consider that when looking at potential businesses to invest in.
Definitely, it seems like a case of hindsight being 2020, but still very valuable lessons 100%. To be able to pass on.
Yeah, 100%.
So in your mind, where does social entrepreneurship or social enterprises fit in with other global health and development work?
I think that they're sort of part and parcel, right? Like, so the private sector is always going to be needed to build the GDP of a country. And I'm quite a firm believer that, most of the issues that the global south faces will be solved through higher GDP. Like once you get a GDP per capita of $10,000 to $30,000, a lot of the issues that you see in terms of health, etc., although that's still present in some ways in Denmark or whatever, they're not nearly the same as what they might be in Tanzania. And so, like, there's a lot of obviously discussion around inequality and whatnot, but at the same time, once there is definitely a trickle down effect, and so if you can increase the income of a country to $20,000 per capita, then even the lowest income person in that country is going to be better off than the general person in a country where the per capita income is $1,000. So overall, I think increasing GDP is a good thing, and doing it through private enterprise is probably the best way that can be done, because like I say, it's sustainable money that's going into the system. And then, so where does do other global development and health and whatnot NGOs come into it? I think, in lieu of those government services being there, until there's higher amounts of money going into the government coffers, they can efficiently assist to provide some of those services, whether it's in conjunction with the government to increase the funds that they have targeted at whatever, or if it's them themselves doing some of that. I think that's sort of where it fits in, basically, in like I was saying before, the government not having the capacity in a lot of areas, so sort of focusing on where those sort of holes in capacity are. But I think in general, if it can be something can be done through a, I guess, capitalist method, for lack of a better phrase, it probably should be done in that fashion, and it should be looked at. Okay, how can we incentivize businesses to actually do it here? What is the best method of doing that to incentivize businesses to be profitable in this area, as opposed to how can we do it through development / NGO approach?
So in an ideal world, the NGOs sort of provide the bridging support until the private social enterprises or other private companies can actually bring up that GDP to a level where the NGOs kind of become redundant.
Basically, yeah. And don't get me wrong, I think I was having a chat with my girlfriend about this last night, even in a in Denmark, there's still room for NGOs to assist and provide services that the government isn't providing or isn't able to provide. So, and that's part of the system that social democracy does, and I think that's a good thing, right? Like having NGOs that can pop up that are more targeted than the government is able to do is something that is a nice facet of social democracy. Like the NGO, I guess, can be thought of as an agile part of society which allows services to be provided at a societal level that a government isn't able to target by themselves, because the government is a little bit slower in the way that it works, and so because of that, they sometimes aren't as agile to providing those services. So I think there's still room for NGOs even in Norway or Denmark, and I'm using those as rich social democracies examples. And so there's always going to be a place for them, and I think the same places that they are in Norway/Denmark are the same. It's the same sort of realm as in Tanzania, except Tanzania just have less money available.
So have you got a sense for where the key leverage points would be for engineers to contribute in the global health and development space?
So I guess there's two ways you can look at that. So in general, engineers tend to be, I guess, analytical and have a numbers-based approach to things. So that's essentially useful anywhere. So I think, and project management, all those sorts of things, just a general functional human is pretty useful in most places. And so that engineering, what you're taught during school and university and what you learn in the job, that's a very useful skill set anywhere you go and anything you sort of target. And so, I often jest that basically every degree should be engineering. There shouldn't be other degrees, and then you can try to do anything else you want after that. And the world would probably be a better place if that was the case. But otherwise, in terms of just hard engineering and where that can be useful, again, a lot of places, like the technical capabilities and the number of capable engineers in a country like Tanzania are less, unsurprisingly, than in Australia. And so being able to design things and work with junior engineers in Tanzania or in other countries is definitely a good thing. And so, the hard engineering skills are definitely useful. I think I've mentioned I've got a friend who's a civil engineer from Belgium, and he is working with a development project doing stone arch bridges. And that's something where he's working with local engineers and training them in how to build these bridges and making design guidelines, these sorts of things. And that's a great project, which has much lower cost bridges than normal concrete bridges, because you have the lower labor costs in Tanzania versus other places. So I think that sort of thing is a great example of where engineering is useful, and similarly, like designing processes, designing and looking at like how machinery should be designed for in the Tanzanian context. Like this sort of agile design is also super useful.
That makes a lot of sense. Have you got any tips for how so pathways for engineers to be doing this sort of work in sub-Saharan Africa?
I think like that's I feel one of the things that is missing a little bit, right? And I feel that actually what you guys are doing is great in that respect, where you can potentially be connecting engineers who want to do something a little bit different to organizations that need them, is a great thing. Like there's also, for instance, Engineers Without Borders that might be there, or otherwise. I wish I had a better answer to that. Like if we could sometimes get engineering assistance on some small things here and there, or like engineers to come work as a project manager for 6 months, that or much longer even, that would be super useful. So yeah, I unfortunately don't have a great answer, and I think that what you guys are doing is a great thing because it will help facilitate that. So the answer is look at high impact engineers, and you'll find it.
I very much hope that we can go some way towards filling that need, and definitely anybody who's listening should reach out to us if they would like help with connections or anything else we can facilitate there. I guess before we sort of start wrapping up, is there anything else you wanted to mention or wanted to go back and touch on again?
I think the social enterprise as a recurring fund is a good one, right? So yeah, like I was saying, like with it the way that we sort of look at it, it's a slightly less efficient give directly that continues on, and so a country like Tanzania. Because the GDP per capita is quite low, like I say, we're a small nothing business. We probably account for in the vicinity of 1/10,000th of the GDP of the country, and that's you can add some multiplier effects because of the velocity of money, etc. But I think that's just a good example. If you had 10,000 other people doing, which in the grand scheme of things isn't a lot. Doing miscellaneous small business in Tanzania, like you double the GDP of the country, and that's like I think a nice way to look at the potential impact of running companies in places like Tanzania, because you have 50, 60 million people now in Tanzania, and simply by running a small country, you can have an outsized impact on those 60 million people because, unfortunately, through historical circumstances, the GDP tends to be less than in other places. So I think that's a good way to sort of think about things is simply, by even having a small company, which wouldn't be thought of really as a company even, or barely in somewhere like Australia, like the turnover, you'd be a tiny business, allows you to have an outsized impact in a country like Tanzania, and employ a lot more people, and like I say, have a compounding impact on the overall growth of the country, which I think is something that people don't really look at enough, and it's something to think about when looking at what sort of impact you want to do overall.
How much did that fact that there's just such a big difference between somewhere like Australia and somewhere like Tanzania play into you making that move over there? Was it like the driving thing, or was it part of I guess a broader set of considerations?
Yeah, so it probably was the driving thing. So it was, I guess, pre-effective altruism, and so like older development economic books like The Bottom Billion by Paul Collier, The End of Poverty by Jeffrey Sachs, those sorts of things. really played into it. And then, Peter Singer came along and he wrote a couple of very, very persuasive books, The Life You Can Save, that sort of thing. And those sort of really got us thinking about, okay, what can we do? What's our skill set? What's I guess what are we uniquely able to do that other people potentially aren't? And so we said, okay, start miscellaneous business in sub-Saharan Africa is something that we would probably be better suited to than others. Like it would hurt us less, or like we would be fine doing it, whereas other people it might be a bit of a sacrifice. Whereas for us, it wasn't really, because it's enjoyable, right? And so I think those, and then when Effective Altruism formed up around, like based off of Peter Singer's ideas, we very, very quickly aligned with the movement and sort of said, okay, like obviously it's kind of in different directions than when we first started, but we're still very closely aligned with how EA looks at the world. And I think it's still, very positive what it can be teaching to the rest of the world.
How have your impressions of EA changed over that course of time, having been exposed to those sort of ideas a bit before EA really kicked off as a larger scale movement?
In general, I think it's still, like I say, largely positive. I feel, I don't want to have gripes at EA, because I think overall the movement is fantastic, and you have a lot of very good people, and everyone is in general well-meaning. You might have some bad actors, which obviously we don't need to discuss now. But I think in general, EA doesn't really look enough at the potential of social enterprise, such that it doesn't rely on continued support from outside. Like it's sort of, like I say, a sustainable model. And that's something which I feel that is a good thing. And so if EA started, instead of, or in addition to saying, okay, let's throw money at global health interventions or NGOs doing good things, let's also start putting money into social enterprises which are aligned with EA. I think that would be a good thing for the moment. So that's sort of one of the differences. And then we can talk about some long-term aspects. And I feel that again, building GDP up quicker also serves some of the sort of long-termism stuff. I haven't quite. One day I'll get around to writing a bit more on that, but like getting people outside of that wanted $10,000 or above $10,000 per capita GDP makes people much less inclined to, potentially very, very negative externalities for the world. So, so I think that there's still close alignment with EA and how it looks. And that's one of the nice things about EA, is that you can look at you can discuss these things and have interesting discussions on the merits of both, and both people are well-intentioned. Then you might not agree on the end result, but at the same time, you can still be happy with the discussion and learn something from those interactions.
Yeah, 100%. I found that to be a real strength of the EA movement as a whole. Just people being willing to disagree in good faith and sort of hash it out, not in a competitive or aggressive way, but just in a very very friendly and sort of constructive manner.
Yeah. So
how can listeners support the work that you're doing at Upendo Handi or Dark Earth Carbon?
That's a good question, to be honest. We'll potentially have roles opening up. And then, I would say buy some Tanzanian honey, but unfortunately we're not sold as Tanzanian honey. Typically, basically our honey organic, it gets sold to packers and then blended into generic organic honeys for supermarkets, and yeah, you never know where it's from. So I think, but also like I say, in general, looking at other companies and looking for potential opportunities in Tanzania and other developing countries is a good thing, and helping to build up capacity as someone that has expertise or experience from Australia or wherever is useful. So building that in house and working in these sorts of places is a good thing. And so if you're not directly supporting us. And working with us, then also working with other companies, I feel would be pretty handy. And I think it's also just a good way to build up different skill sets. So even if you've got 10 years as an engineer in Australia doing whatever, or you've got, you're straight out of university, working for 6 months to 2 years or whatever in Tanzania context will be useful for like later on life jobs and stuff. So I think that's something that could be handy for everyone. And so looking for people to other companies that would be able to take on engineers and stuff. And I feel that it'd be huge amounts because, like I say, engineers are very handy people to have around, just the analytical thinking and whatnot.
Fantastic. What would be your top 3 resources for people who want to learn more about social entrepreneurship or social enterprises in a sub-Saharan African context?
Yeah, that's a tough one, to be honest. I think in general, YouTube is pretty good. And podcasts like the High Impact Engineers podcast, I've heard is fantastic for it. But yeah, unfortunately, and like maybe this says something, but I read a lot of stuff talking about social enterprise in sub-Saharan Africa, and oftentimes I'm a little bit skeptical and poo-pooing of some of the things. So I would say, there's unfortunately the resources aren't great for those particular subjects. I would like that to be different. We're actually starting up a blog by the time this is released. Hopefully it will be up and running. I'll send you a link regardless, which sort of talks about some of these matters, and could be a nice resource to link to. And otherwise, I guess Marginal Revolution oftentimes has some interesting articles on there, and maybe not directly related to social entrepreneurship and whatnot. Reading that is always handy, as well as just reading The Economist on a weekly basis, because it gives you a good roundup and a good general knowledge in general. In general, just read more. It's always handy.
Terrific. I was about to say that it sounds like you need to write a book on social entrepreneurship in sub-Saharan Africa, but I guess a blog is the first step in that direction.
Yeah, that's the idea.
Terrific. What do you wish you had invented, and why?
I had invented. That's a tough question. I guess if we're looking like throughout all history, inventing something like the steam engine would have been good, because it has had such an outsized impact on the world. Being able to harness energy and not be linked to basically bioenergy is like the thing which moved us from sub $100, $200 GDP per capita to where we are today. And so I think in terms of all the outsized impact of invention, that's probably the one which really set us on the path that we're on today. But otherwise, what do I wish I invented? I don't know, because the next thing that is invented and changes the world hasn't yet been invented, right?
Very true. All right. So finally, where can people find you online if they want to learn more about the work that you're doing?
Yeah. Right now, I've got almost no online presence. The blog / think tank that we're going to be starting, I think is probably the best place. And like I say, we'll be letting you know where that is, so you can link to it. Yeah.
Sounds good. We'll put that in the show notes as soon as it's up and running.
Perfect.
All right. Well, Arno, thank you very much for joining me.
Yeah, no, thank you very much. It's been a lot of fun.
I hope you enjoyed that conversation with Arno. For detailed show notes and valuable resources related to this episode, please visit engineeredforimpact.show/Arno. That's ARNO. You can support Engineered for Impact by leaving us a review on your preferred podcasting platform of choice, dropping a comment on the YouTube video for this episode, or heading to engineeredforimpact.show and leaving us anonymous feedback. You can also support the show financially. Engineered for Impact is brought to you by our foundation, High Impact Engineers, organized in the USA. Please visit engineeredforimpact.show to donate. Thanks for listening, and happy problem solving.